Hello there, you're watching the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they come in. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be chatting through the headlines with the Director of the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, Faiza Shaheen, and the Chief Executive of the think tank Localis, Liam Booth-Smith. So good evening to both of you.
Good evening.
So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages. And the Eye leads with the death of the Russian exile Nikolai Glushkov in London, which is now being treated as murder. It's the same story on the front of the Telegraph, which says that a post-mortem found that the arch critic of President Putin had been strangled. And The Guardian too leads with that story. The Star says the upshot of the whole spy row could be the delay of the World Cup in Russia, with England stepping in to host it instead. The Daily Mail asks why the Parsons Green tube bomber was allowed to come to Britain even though he was a trained jihadi, and why his foster parents were never told about his past. The Times investigates what it says is a second sex scandal involving Oxfam charity workers in Haiti. The Mirror carries claims of a new sexual abuse scandal centred on the Shropshire town of Telford. The Express leads with a speech by Prince Harry that sparked a row over defence cuts. And the Financial Times reports that the row over foreign steel import tariffs imposed by the US could widen to include a levy on digital products. So plenty to chat about there with Faiza Shaheen and Liam Booth-Smith. And once again, stories involving Russians are dominating the front pages. You've picked out the Financial Times. It's not their main story, but their second story there at the bottom focuses on the Foreign Secretary getting stuck in today.
No, absolutely. He's done what he does best, which is to lead with emotion. And I think he's made it much worse. This is all about how today, during an interview, he seemed to get a little bit overcome by himself and by the moment, and essentially pointed the finger directly at Vladimir Putin.
He said it was overwhelmingly likely.
Overwhelmingly likely, yeah. It's a sort of interesting turn of phrase. And that's a real escalation. And it's completely the wrong sort of escalation as well. You've got Theresa May working in the background, trying to gain the support of other Western democratic leaders to engage in sanctions, to be coordinated. And this is completely the wrong sort of escalation if we're attempting to put the squeeze on Russia.
Well, yes, and do you think that this was sanctioned by Number 10? We haven't heard any kind of slapdown for Boris Johnson for pointing the finger directly at President Putin like this.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I think Theresa May has been quite careful in her wording. So this seems like he's gone too far. We don't know what's going on behind the doors and what she might have said to him or her office would have said to him. But this is a very important time to have calm heads, to think about the best way to deal with this incredible, extraordinary and horrifying incident. And we cannot have our chief diplomat speaking out in this way. We also had Gavin Williamson talk about Russia, shutting up and going away. Look, this is not the type of wording that senior diplomats should be using. And we have to be careful here again, because with Putin, this sort of wording and this sort of pushback plays into his narrative about, oh, the West is against us. And obviously with those presidential elections going on in Russia, let's just be smart. And I hope Theresa May is talking to Boris and is telling him, look, we're doing this in a considered way. We're not going to do this, just speak first.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of strategy behind this type of intervention. I can see some of the arguments behind Gavin Williamson's speech yesterday, which was all about announcing that the government is going to act with investment in things like vaccinations around and research around kind of chemical weapons.
Was the language he used helpful, do you think?
Well, no, and that again, if you watch the video of the speech, it's a little bit off the cuff. It's in a moment where we're trying to project strength and we don't seem to have an agreement on what that looks like precisely. The story for the politics for this, for the people in Number 10 is a little bit difficult because Theresa May isn't being that well supported by some of her senior cabinet colleagues. She's trying to project a sense of calm, as Faiza says, and she's also trying to work with the international community to get some sort of agreement on what a coordinated response would look like. And this doesn't help that.
This is undermining that, right?
And before we do move on, what do you make of how Theresa May is handling it? I mean, do you think she's, to use a perhaps unfortunate phrase, having a good crisis?
Look, I am not really one to give Theresa May compliments often, but I think she has been quite measured in the way she's spoken about what's happened. She set out, for instance, there's possibly, two outcomes here. Either it's Kremlin or Kremlin has lost control of this nerve agent. I think some of the things that she's put forward are more symbolic. I think we need to look more, and we'll talk in a minute about what we can do on the oligarch side and the money.
Let's bring that in now, because there is a double-page spread in the Times that you wanted to focus on. This is pages 10 and 11 of the Times. Yeah, so there are other areas that you think that she could be acting on, are there?
Yeah, look, there's a huge amount of money that comes through London in particular from oligarchs of Russia, and they've been using London as a safe haven because we've been seen as a soft touch. Look, this is one way in which we can quite clearly say, and it's actually not helpful either because they buy properties, they don't live in them, it has all kinds of consequences for the property market here too. And we don't want that money, that money laundering. It's something like 90 billion a year, apparently, that is coming through. And it's one way to annoy some people that potentially can have an impact and say to Putin, like, look, this is affecting us.
There's two, it's right, it's a big issue. There are two things I think are worth pointing out about it. The first is that to do some of the restrictive type activities they're talking about here might involve the government breaking its own laws. So there is just a question of kind of what's the legal basis for our action. So if we're going to freeze assets, you have to have some evidence that they've been engaged in something that you can freeze assets over, and that's going to take time. I think the second bit here, which I guess links to some of what Faiza's talking about, which is that I think this is a really interesting opportunity that Jeremy Corbyn's missed. I think actually, instead of sort of scratching the itch of sort of Iraq and WMD and trying to make those connections, he should have really focused in on the internal coordination of Theresa May's government. It's fine to expel 23 diplomats, but he could have easily said at the dispatch box, that's not enough. You need to be stemming the flow of Russian money into the city. You need to be directing banks not to take it.
He did say stuff like that on Monday, and in his Guardian article, he did bring that up again.
And he has been criticised for that as well.
No, but the important bit here is that we can't criticise the government and Boris Johnson and others for flooding the airwaves with contradictory and unhelpful remarks and not hold Jeremy Corbyn to the same standard. If he's got a consistent message that is calm and collected about holding the government to account, whilst not compromising his principles, but also actually acknowledging the evidence that the security services have collated. I just think that if he can't make contradictory arguments, is what I'm saying here. I think that he's got to be consistent in how he is trying to support the government and the country.
Let's just show on that double-page spread that we saw a minute ago. There is the article about Corbyn at the bottom, not given access to top-secret information, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But on that issue that Liam was bringing up, do you think it's right that Jeremy Corbyn should be asking some of these questions, should be asking for more evidence, or should he step in with the government and present a united front, as some have suggested that he should be doing?
He's been very clear in condemning what's happened, but again, at this time, we do need to keep cool heads. We need to ask the right questions. We need to build the evidence. And I think I don't see Corbyn as contradicting himself. He has spoken about the money. He has spoken about what we need to do more over the longer term. And what's interesting is when I was watching back, I think there's been a lot of hysteria around what Corbyn said. And when you watch it yourself or read his articles, it's all very sensible questions about a very, very serious matter. And in fact, it's almost like Boris and Gavin Williamson are going more out there and contradicting Theresa May than what Corbyn is. He's essentially saying very similar things.
Do you think that's right, or is he undermining Theresa May's stance on this?
Oh, no, I think there's an element of truth to it, that what he's saying. There's some sense to having a calm, measured response. I think the problem with it is, and it's in this story about him not being given access. Essentially, when I'm reading that, what I read is that Theresa May doesn't trust him. And that's fair enough, because it doesn't seem to appear to me that Corbyn doesn't trust our security services either.
How is that fair enough?
Actually, no, I'm finished. Right. It's quite clear from him trying to make some sort of connection to the WMD dodgy dossier, which was formulated under his own party 15 years ago, to try and connect the two now in some sort of attempt to justify his own position. I don't know. I think that's questionable.
I don't think that's what's happening there. I think
literally here in the article, it's got it right there. The flawed intelligence. He said that. It's in his own article.
Yes, but I think that the connection that is being made there is simply to say, at these moments in our recent history, we have lost our heads too often. We have followed the evidence that has been incorrect. Let's ask the right questions. Let's look at what's happening. Let's follow protocol. We believe in the laws. We made the laws, right? And we also need to build that international consensus. That's all he's saying. That's
We'll get into it
fair
again.
enough.
So when he's one of his questions at the dispatch box was, have you given the evidence to the Russian security services? So essentially saying, look, I don't trust our own, so let's hand it to the Russians and see what they've got to say.
Look, this is a man that has been right far more than others, both within the political establishment, whether it be about Iraq, about Libya, about rushing in, about jumping the gun. And so, I personally think that that's very unfair for him not to be given that evidence.
OK, and a quick question, is that going to cause him problems with some of his own MPs who don't agree that he's taking the right stance?
Well, of course, that's already caused problems. But the point is that a lot of Corbyn supporters and a lot of people will want us to take a different approach. Look, our approach to Russia has clearly not worked.
No one's has.
So here is a man that is thinking...
Read the Munich 2007 Security Conference speech when basically he says, you're not our friends. The West, they're not our friends. Democracy, they use it in their own language, in their own strategic defensive
He's not
documents.
arguing that Russia isn't a problem. What we're saying is, let's think about how we can take action that works. Let's be more effective. And we're not used to a thoughtful man in a leadership position to take that. It's a shock to the system.
We are going to have to take a break. We can perhaps read the speech in the break. You might have a little bit of time, but coming up, we've got lots to talk about. We're going to be debating more of the pressing issues of the day, including whether jam or cream should go first on your scone or scone. Scone. We're going to turn our attention to the front of the Daily Telegraph, and the second story on their front page focuses on the NHS and a tax hike being suggested for older workers to help fund it.
Yeah, so this comes after the spring statement this week where obviously Philip Hammond read out what was happening in the economy, and there was a real sense of disconnect between the buoyant economy he was speaking about and obviously a lot of news about the NHS crisis over the Christmas and winter period, various different issues from homelessness to the impacts of universal credit change on people and child poverty and various different things. And so I guess the question now for the government is how they fix some of these problems. Of course, they withdrew a lot of money, or they at least didn't put in as much money as the NHS needed, and now are finding themselves in hot water. And so one idea being trialled here is that they would tax older workers, which I guess is in reflecting on the fact that they can't be taxing younger people because millennials are already hard done by. So, and they don't want to put them off more because obviously they heavily voted in favour of Labour. So potentially here this is about... I think it's quite interesting because there has been polls recently that have demonstrated that people are willing to pay more taxes for the NHS.
But interesting if the Tories will be asking older people to pay more when older people are perhaps more traditionally Conservative voters?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, they got burnt for this in the general election. And I say fair play to them for doing it, for going back to it as well, because they're right to do this. We need... Whatever you think about the last sort of 5-6 years in terms of funding going into it, it's been pretty clear to me, anybody, to anyone else, that the Conservative Party, intellectually and in government, has been trying to find a way of leveraging more money into the health and social care service. And it's struggled to do so for lots of different reasons. People like Nick Bowles were recently talking about a hypothecated NHS tax in the Conservative manifesto. Which is a
tax where you specifically pay an amount of money directly to the ring-fence.
Absolutely. The model they're describing here actually exists somewhere else in the world. It exists in Japan. They have a system there where over 40s pay into a social insurance scheme, which enables people to access social care as they get older. And you're right, you're absolutely right, Faiza. Polling has shown that people are prepared to pay more for this stuff. And I've been looking at some private polls today that we're commissioning for our own research, which again show that people are actually pretty compassionate about this.
I think the big thing, though, here is that it has to be done in a progressive way, so the richest pay most, and that's what came off quite well with the Labour manifesto last year, that sense of the broadest shoulders. And here we have to think again about a wealth tax as well. I think that will be critical.
I disagree on that, but there you go.
All right.
Yeah, let's crack on. So you want to talk about Harry and defence cuts, and we have to talk about scones, obviously, or scones. So Harry is featured on the front page of the Daily Express and on a double-page spread inside, talking about cuts to the defence budget.
Yeah, doing what royals shouldn't do, which is running their mouth on issues of politics, just like his dad does.
Does it make a difference, the fact that he is served?
I think there are ways... Well, that's very hard, because I'm sure that he has lots and lots of opportunities that none of us would have, no other former serviceman would have, by dint of his position and status. He could make an awful lot of representations about armed services cuts in the same way his father does privately with all those letters. I'm sure he could do something similar too and exert an awful lot of influence. I think him coming out publicly, whether he thought about this or not in the same way, I do think it's overstepping the mark.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree. You know, I can see he may not have planned this way, but the royals have to be very careful. It's, you know, not their place to get involved in this way. And whilst I'm an anti-cuts campaigner, like, you know, I also recognise I have to draw a line on what royals can say.
OK, well, you're moving on to a story that also features an extraordinary royal picture. This is the Express, page 3, and it's the scone debate, but a fantastic picture of the Queen. I don't know if she's horrified by whether someone put the jam on before the cream or the other way around, but this is the big debate.
Wasn't this about someone in, was it Cornwall or somewhere, that they put the jam on top of the cream, which just seems utterly savage as far as I'm concerned.
It says here,
first,
between
right?
Devon and Cornwall, the issue is fiercely divisive, with Devonians preferring cream first and Cornish folk starting with jam.
I'm with the Cornish.
Well, there you go, first world problems for you.
Yeah, there you go.
But you're a scone lady.
Scones. I'd say scones, yeah. But I don't know if that's an East London thing.
Depends how posh the company I'm with. If I was with the Queen, I'd just mirror whatever she was saying. You know?
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to look out of place.
That's probably the way to go,
Yeah.
however the Queen's...
We demand to find out what she says. On that note, we will leave it. But Faiza and Liam, you're going to be back again at 11:30. But for the moment, thanks very much.
From a
Murder in a bombing at London's Parsons Green tube station. It's emerged that he'd been referred to the government's de-radicalisation programme before the attack. Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they come in. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the Director of the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, Faiza Shaheen, and the Chief Executive of the think tank Localis, Liam Booth-Smith. So hello to both of you. Hello. So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages. And the Eye leads with the death of Russian exile Nikolai Glushkov in London, which Scotland Yard says is now being treated as murder. It's the same story for the Telegraph, which says a post-mortem found that he'd been strangled. And the Guardian too leads on that story. The Star says the upshot of the whole spy row could be the delay of the World Cup in Russia, with England stepping in to host it instead. The Daily Mail asks why the Parsons Green tube bomber was allowed to come to Britain, even though he was a trained jihadi, and why his foster parents were never told about his past. The Times investigates what it says is a second sex scandal involving Oxfam charity workers in Haiti. The Mirror carries claims of a new sexual abuse scandal centred on the Shropshire town of Telford. The Express leads with a speech by Prince Harry that has sparked a row over defence cuts. And the Financial Times reports that the row over foreign steel import tariffs imposed by the US could widen to include a levy on digital products. And finally, The Sun has a picture of Prince Harry's fiancée Meghan Markle with a gun during her TV acting career. The headline, Meg My Day. Moving swiftly on, let's talk about the papers now with Faiza Shaheen and Liam Booth-Smith. And we're going to kick off with the revelation that's on the front of many of the papers that another Russian found dead earlier in this week has now been, we're told that Scotland Yard is investigating it as a murder.
Yeah, there's no sense of connection yet that they've confirmed otherwise between this and the Sergei Skripal case, but people are now starting to comment about it being a pattern. And it's another Russian exile, an enemy of Vladimir Putin and his regime, turning up dead in our island. And Nikolai Glushkov is a former friend, it says in the story, of Boris Berezovsky, who recorded his suicide, but lots of concerns when he died in 2013 that it wasn't, and there were concerns around it. I think what's interesting about this story, and it's like a lot of the others that I think we'll see emerge if there are any more, as we delve into the past and identify this stuff. There are some hallmarks to it. Plausible deniability all the way, so very, very hard to actually pin anything down. A lot of the quotes used to support certain cases, they're all anonymous. It's friends of people. It's very, very hard to kind of pin down someone to talk on the record and say this is categorically what's going on. And also the connection to very significant sums of money and big business. Later on in the paper on page 10, it talks about here how police are very interested in identifying whether the murder of Nikolai Glushkov was anything to do with the High Court case, which is ongoing at the moment, about he's being sued by Aeroflot, which is the Russian national carrier, for a sum of 99 million. So big money.
And some suggestions that he may have been due in court on the day that he was found dead. But as we say, no connection being made to the Sergei Skripal case. And in fact, a spokesman for the Prime Minister has been kept informed, they say. She said that the Prime Minister had been kept informed of developments, but stressed that Mr Glushkov's death was a police matter and no direct link had been made. But it is interesting, isn't it, on a day where the conversation about the Skripal case has gone up another notch, with the Foreign Secretary, for example, deciding to point the finger directly at President Putin. So there's a huge amount of discussion about our relationship with Russia.
Yeah, and so that discussion is obviously bringing these stories more to the fore. I mean, in some ways, perhaps, I mean, it seems very extraordinary, but we forget that for over a decade now, London has been a real safe haven for those escaping the Kremlin and those that are still in with Putin. It's somewhere that they're attracted to because it's seen as a light touch in terms of owning properties, money laundering. And so we have inevitably essentially ended up with quite a lot of spooks in and around London. And that doesn't make this okay. But what it does mean is that we have to think very seriously about the way in which potentially, Russia's sanctioned, state-sanctioned murders are taking place in our city and how we protect people. And there's the point about protection, but there's also the point about what we do in terms of making sure that people aren't money laundering here, that we aren't seen as this soft touch. And so that those friends of Putin, that's possibly one way in which we can deal with this, because a lot of the other ways in which we're trying, in terms of gestures, symbolic gestures of diplomacy, are not working so far.
Well, and there's a double-page spread inside the Times that I think we can look at now, which is pages 10 and 11, I think, of the Times, and it covers so many different aspects of this conversation. The oligarchs' issue and their assets is covered there, that you just touched on there, Faiza, in the bottom right-hand corner. They also touch on the latest murder investigation. They talk about Corbyn's, his line as well. But you did want to talk about as well this question over the World Cup and what England, in this case, should do about it.
So there's some MPs, John Woodcock in Austin from Labour and Bernard Jenkin, a Tory, have all come forward and said that we should consider a boycott. I'm not quite sure whether sort of out and out calling for it, but primarily for the safety of fans, which is a genuine concern. It was a concern anyway before all of this blows up. The Times have done a poll as well. It shows that a majority of people are still in favour of going along, and I think actually they're right to go along as well, because sport, as we talked about earlier, it is a form of diplomacy, and it can take the heat out of this issue, potentially.
Do you think that's right? Or would you be comfortable to travel and support England in the World Cup in Russia?
That it could potentially be, it's all about where things go from now. It could potentially be a problem. There is a question of if there would be extra violence there with England fans and the clashes with the Russians and the Russian fans. It would have to escalate quite a lot, I think, for us to withdraw the team.
But would it be an effective statement, do you think, to do?
No, we were just talking about it, and maybe if the way things are going, if not just England but a number of other teams also pulled out, that would send a very strong message. But it's a shame. I love football. This country loves football. For us to miss out on the World Cup that only happens every 4 years, to rearrange that on such short notice, I guess is very, very unlikely. It's not impossible that this could happen, this boycott could happen.
If we did it on our own, I think it would cause disruption, but it wouldn't stop it going ahead. And I think it would just cause an awful lot of irritation. I think it's worth remembering in all these stories, the football one as well, the Russian people don't want to feel embarrassed by their own country. It's deeply embarrassing to have your government accused of state-sponsored assassinations, to have people not want to come and visit your country. They're very proud. They're a civilizational state. I mean, they're really proud people. So I think that there's a bit about talking about Putin's regime, and there's also the impact this will have on the Russian people and their own psyche. And I'm keen to make the separation between them. I think that we may have issues with him, but actually boycotting a big national celebration in their own right, I'm less sure.
And Boris Johnson was very keen to make that distinction when he pointed the finger at President Putin, saying that he personally is highly likely, I can't remember what the phrase he used was, overwhelmingly likely to have personally ordered the poisoning of Sergei Skripal.
I mean, that language in itself is unhelpful and will go down to support Putin and his idea of the West being against him and helping building support. But again, we don't want to play into that Putin narrative, and definitely pulling out of the World Cup would.
And quickly, what do you make of Boris Johnson saying that? Let's talk about how some of the politicians have handled it, if we can, very quickly. Boris Johnson today, how's Theresa May handling it, and what do you think of Jeremy Corbyn as well?
Boris Johnson, a very silly remark today, escalating in the wrong way. Theresa May is trying to build an international coalition of support. That's about bringing people together. It's not about creating pithy sound bites in order to get yourself in the newspaper. On Jeremy Corbyn, I think he's actually, in some senses, talked a lot of common sense and been quite a calming influence on the debate. But I also think he's made some tactical errors. I think is conflating this issue with the 2003 dossier on Iraq is massively unhelpful, and that will undermine his argument with a lot of people, particularly his own backbenchers.
No, I mean, I think that Corbyn's history and reputation for being questioning, for not rushing to judgment. He's campaigned his whole political career against chemical weapons. He knows a lot about this stuff. He's very well placed to lead in this moment, and he leads in a very different way than we're used to. We're used to kind of, we're going to go in strong, I'm going to go in stronger, we would go in stronger, and that's usually the thing that happens. It escalates that way internally in political point scoring. But here we have some important questioning about, how we go in, what we do, and how we can really connect this, especially to Putin directly.
Well, we've already agreed on that one, but I think this idea, you said earlier, we have that concern about how do we keep people and secure, how do we keep our people in London, in the city, safe? Well, actually, his sort of approach, it's sort of right now, let's just wait and see, guys. Whereas actually, Theresa May, I think, has had as we talked about earlier, a much better crisis. I think actually she's been very prime ministerial. She's led in quite a considered and calm way, and I think that. If it was a choice between her and Corbyn, I'd pick her.
I'm going to move on just because there's one other issue that we want to talk about before the break, and that is the question of the Parsons Green bomber who has today been found guilty of attempted murder. This is the Mail pages 6 and 7. There's a double-page spread they've got here. But the angle they're taking is why he was allowed into the country. He was an asylum seeker, wasn't he?
Yeah, of course we have... given our role in the world, how rich we are, our role in the Iraq war, we do take refugees, and that's the right thing to do. I mean, many of us would argue we should take more. I think the big problem here is how this young man, essentially, there were people saying that there's problems here through, for instance, the Prevent programme, which has failed in many ways.
He was referred to the Prevent programme.
He was referred to, but he wasn't given the mentoring support. There's all kinds of ways in which he slipped through the net. This is a very sad story. This is someone that came, he lost his father. He apparently blames that loss on the coalition forces. And he obviously did harbour some aggression towards that. And we should have really supported him. That's the big thing here for me. We shouldn't shirk our responsibility. We should take refugees, but we do need to support them. They've been through very, very traumatic times.
Do you think that's right? Or do you think, given the interview that he apparently gave on entering the country, which suggested that he'd been trained by IS, on that initial interview, do you think that more questions should have been asked then at the time, or what do you think the strategy should have been?
So I agree with Fazia on the point about refugees. We are a very wealthy nation, and it's our I'd say it's our responsibility to try and be compassionate as much as we possibly can. Clearly in this, there have been just a litany of systemic failures to actually act on the litany of red lights, the flags that have been raised, either things he said in interviews or ways behaved. I think the difficult thing I had reading this was you're caught between the desire to be compassionate towards what is quite clearly a very sort of troubled and sick young man and wanting to provide support, and then also what is quite a kind of visceral dislike and distaste for someone who is, was a pretty vile potential mass murderer who wanted to murder people, children, and I find it very, very hard, actually, to kind of... I suppose that's why it's compassion. One has to kind of dig deep for it. But it's very, very difficult for me to look at that and think he's someone that, knowing what he said at the border with those interviews, that probably should have been let in. I think there's a strong argument to say probably shouldn't.
I mean, it's pretty scary for all of us that use the tube on a day-to-day basis. Like, this is... that someone like him saying the things he was, being quite upfront about it, and his, you know, his foster parents, etc., college. I mean, so many people raise the alarm. There's been huge mistakes made here, and people want to feel safe. And obviously,
the other
kinds of
question
stories
is the foster parents, who everyone says are the most amazing people, but they weren't passed on some of the information, weren't given information about some of the concerns and about what he'd said on entry. That should be looked at as well.
Absolutely, it should be. The information. I mean, foster carers. It's very, very difficult to recruit foster carers in this country. We have a significant shortage. These people do incredible work. They open up their homes often when they have their own children as well, or other children that they may be taking care of. The idea that the information is not shared with them is utterly unacceptable.
This was I mean, it's quite interesting, this story. I mean, in the sense that this was a grade A student. He'd got some award in college for being the best student, etc. I mean, he's a very, very troubled young man. And if they were going to take him in, then they should have had a programme. They should have told the foster parents. They should have, you know, the Prevent programme should have stood up and done its job. So this could have been very, very different. And
he apparently won an award and spent some of the money on chemicals.
Oh, gosh.
We're going to take a break. Still to come after the break, though, on a lighter note, we're going to introduce you to the first polar bear in 25 years to be born in the UK. The picture of it, anyway. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview tonight with me and Faiza Shaheen and Liam Booth-Smith. So welcome to both of you. Let's take a look at the front page of The Guardian, which you're concentrating on their second story there. Towers with flammable cladding at risk of attack.
Yeah, part of the reason I pulled this story out is because on the way here I go past the Grenfell Tower, and it always fills me with so much dread that happened. And the fact that this story is about how many high-rises still have this flammable cladding around the building, and that work hasn't been done. And there's a concern here that it could, you know, people could use that for arson attacks, etc. But there's a real issue of safety here and why action hasn't been taken. So, of those that have been tested, so it's 288 towers in England that have failed. Apparently only 7 buildings have had the appropriate work to make sure that cladding is now safe, and those buildings are now safe. You know, from the families in terms of justice they asked for a more diverse set of people on the panel on the inquiry. That was rejected, though it's going to be debated in Parliament. It's just this story that's going to go on, and something that we cannot forget, both in terms of those buildings right now and making sure that they are safe, but also in terms of getting justice for those survivors.
I think everyone would agree with that. But are there reasons? It says there are waits of up to 7 months to test alternative systems. Is that part of the problem, that they're not clear exactly what should be done?
Yeah, there's so one of the things that came out of the Grenfell tragedy was a very acute desire amongst people working in local government to try and find ways of making sure that local communities were really involved in how their homes and their estates were being redeveloped and regenerated. And it was so bad before that it seems like regeneration had become a really dirty word amongst a lot of communities. The problem with that sort of engagement, that sort of dialogue, is it just takes quite a long time, and it's very difficult, and money isn't in an abundant supply. We have to target where funding goes. The example of Grenfell is really interesting, is that the traditional estate used to have a road running through it. It still does now. And it was always one identity. But since Grenfell Tower, what you find now is that money's been directed at the one side of the estate where the road cuts, and the other side is not getting as much. So even when we're putting money into areas, you can do it in a way that can be quite divisive.
I mean, I have to say that we shouldn't be saying that we don't have money to make these blocks safe. That money should be found. We're, you know, what, the 6th richest country. I mean, I don't think that's good enough.
Okay.
Given
the government's always said they're going to put the money into doing it, but it's taking time. That's the point. I'm not saying there isn't the money. I'm saying the idea that you can just, like, write a cheque. I mean, there's a way we've got to go about doing this.
OK, we've got very little time, but I'm going to very quickly do 30 seconds or so on each story. Here is health campaigns to take the fizz out of sugary drinks.
This is a great example of how the threat of something from government can encourage businesses to change. And this is where essentially the sugary drinks tax has worked already because companies have decided to change their recipes. What's interesting about this is it might give the Treasury a bit of appetite to look again at other forms of taxes, so like a fat tax or something like that. They may be interested in
And do you think that is a good way of changing behaviours rather than educating people about making the right choices?
Yeah, I think we have to do both. I think in terms of smoking over time, both of those things have worked in tandem. yeah, public health.
You did that so quickly. That was great. We can whiz on and show everybody the first polar bear to be born in the UK for 25 years, is it?
Yeah, how cute is this?
It's
I definitely
gorgeous.
wanted us to cover this. And especially we'll feel at home with the very cold weather this weekend.
Well,
and it's
true.
up in Scotland.
That's a mini beast, a bit like the weather.
Quite.
See what I did there?
Yeah, it's a wonderful story, and it's lovely, and it's going to get really, really cold. You've been gritting the roads outside the studio as well.
Oh,
so, already.
Really? Already? Excellent. Well, go and get your bobble hats on. We're all out of time, but very nice to see you both. Faiza and Liam, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Beneath pink skies by the time